Hello, everybody. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all of the different lands that we live and work on and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We recognise that this land was never ceded. We also want to acknowledge people with lived experience who are in this video today. Everybody who's watching, and we'd like to acknowledge people who care about people with lived experience. That's going to be everybody watching this video. Okay, so today I have the great honour of having three people with us who've been identified by many as leaders in the lived experience and care experience movement in Australia. So I was wondering if you could tell us about what you think is important about lived experience leadership and carer experience leadership.
I think lived experience leadership is important because, as a mental health consumer myself, I think that we have the expertise of our own experience that we can lend to situations, which generally people with learned experience don't. They only know what they've learned, what they've read in books, what they've studied. So they don't really know how it feels. And I think how it feels gives you a whole other perspective of the system to what you've just learned. I also think that when you have lived experience, you have the motivation, the passion to want to push things further than perhaps if you do not have that. So, for example, fighting for our human rights as mental health consumers, um, that is quite a significant and a long fight, probably generations, right? It probably, I don't know how hopeful I should be in terms of it actually happening within my lifetime. So, knowing that and being an advocate that's willing to spend a significant part of my life doing that work while knowing that it might not happen while I'm doing it. I think it's quite hard to do that if you don't have a personal connection to the issue that you're really fighting for. So, yeah, that's why I think it's really important that us consumers are involved in this work.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Priscilla, isn't it? There have been some announcements made just in this last year that I thought I wasn't going to see happen in my lifetime, and it has buoyed me. I'm often introduced as a tireless advocate, that it gets really exhausting. You're saying the same things for decades about what needs to change, and you see it just shift tiny amounts, but even the tiniest amount gives us hope to keep going, doesn't it? Um, Kerry, as a carer, as a family member, what do you think is the most important thing about lived experience leadership?
I think the most important thing about it is the recognition, an explicit recognition that it's a political position that you're taking. I think for both family members as well as people with direct lived experience, that this is in some ways one of the leftovers of the rights movements of the 60s and 70s. It has never been fully recognised as a civil rights movement. And that is the case for families as well. So many families have, it's sort of second tier, but it's the protection of positive rights in a way that families, because of the failure of the current system, really have many of their rights removed, whether it's social, economic, or cultural. And I think it's really, really important to recognise that dismantling the current system that is in place, which we're doing through lived experience leadership, I think is a political position to inherit. I think the other element of lived experience leadership, and we're talking really about a workforce in many ways, is the sector readiness and the organisational readiness. So I'm not convinced that just focusing on the workforce itself is the solution. I think that's probably quite a precarious and irresponsible position for governments to take. So like all civil rights movement, we need allies and we need sector readiness. And so I think for me, a big part of the lived experience leadership conversation is, apart from safeguarding that political literacy around MAD studies and critical psychiatry, is also ensuring that the environment that we're moving into is equally literate.
Tim, what do you think is important about lived experience leadership?
Well, I think it's got to be different. I think it's very adaptive. I think my experience of leadership is that we need to be able to move in and out of different places and spaces and be comfortable there. I think we need to also, in doing that, create spaces or recognise that other people can come and should come into those spaces as well. So it's a bit of a democratic leadership in terms of a shared, in whatever ways we can, we're collaborative and we're sharing leadership and we're trying to share power, and we should reflect the principles that we've built up in sort of a developing a lived experience workshop around mutuality and reciprocity and being authentic, holding hope, focusing on transforming those services. That's the political act, I think, that Kerry's spoken of very, very well. I think, to me, it's about how do we affect change? How do we be leaders with people where we're not doing things for people or doing things to people? Again, reflecting the way our workforce might be there working. I think it's about how do we position the needs, the rights, the people first in all of what we're doing. I like to have the opportunity to work outside of leadership roles or to be with people in whatever context I can who have lived experience and remain firmly with a foot in what's happening in the real world, so to speak. So, I think it's democratic, it's adaptive. We have to adapt to different circumstances, and we have to learn how to share power with people, which includes always bringing on supporting new leaders to come into the space as well.
Great, Tim. I just wanted to also add that leadership it's not a role. It's not something that is assigned to you. I think it doesn't matter what job title you have. You can still be a lived experience leader and do that systemic work that's required for if you want to call it revolution or if you want to call it reform. I think that's an important thing to know too. Even if your first mental health challenge has only been really recently, don't think that you can't step up right now and be a leader.
Yeah, I agree. About 2 years ago, I suppose, I started saying to people, everybody needs to claim their leadership. We can't leave this to, change. We can't leave this revolution or whatever you want to call it to a few so-called leaders. Everybody needs to claim their leadership. It doesn't matter whether you're a peer worker that started yesterday, whether you're on a volunteer, whether you're in an executive position or what, it doesn't matter. We all need to try and see ourselves as part of the solution. And if you see yourself as sort of take on an attitude of leadership, even though it probably doesn't feel real to begin with. I will never have confidence in being a so-called leader. I don't feel like that at all. I don't feel like I'm a leader, and I'm constantly doubting myself. But I learned a long time ago to not let your insecurity stop you from stepping up and doing what needs to be done. And Kerry was talking before about it being political, and we, in the lived experience movement, we talk about the personal being the political, and that what has happened to one person probably has happened to thousands of people, and that's why the personal is the political. So each person, from their personal experience, whatever it is, can take on that a leadership role, whatever it is, even if it's just influencing your neighborhood or influencing your family or your community or the ward that you work in or the team that you work in, whatever. Kerry, could you talk more about the I've just mentioned about the personal is the political. Could you talk more about that saying and how that sits for you?
Yeah, and I think, Faye, that point you make, particularly when you might not realize that it's happening to everyone else, is, that saying comes to mind, is to speak up even though your voice is shaking, because this is political. It is about having power stripped away from you. And I think, we've just got, we're still on the journey of understanding that for most people with lived experience, it's an experience of some kind of violence in their lives that's been overwhelming, whether it's interpersonal as a child or as an adult, or whether it's structural in terms of either the system, the mental health system, racism, whatever. But it has been an experience mostly of violence, and that's political. And so most people have taken that on as an understanding around a diagnosis or symptoms, because we've had a knowledge overlay, a construct around our experiences of distress that tell us that there's something wrong with us. And really, that's one of the hallmarks of the lived experience movement has been, it's not what's wrong with me, it's what's happened to me. And it's a significant paradigm shift that we're starting to see. I think it's a challenging shift. It's a challenging shift for families. It's a challenging shift for the existing, people in power and incumbent services. But for me, that really is the encapsulation of the personal is political. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. And taking your power when you have those experiences of extraordinary distress and pain and discomfort is a really, really difficult thing to do. But I think it's an important part of, in fact, it's inherent within the lived experience workforce, is that you do stand up. That's really one of the key values. So I think we have a long way to go, but it's a vital shift we all have to.
I've recently I've been thinking about, we've been talking for years about trauma-informed services, and far too often it's just lip service. But I've been thinking about that I think we perhaps need to change the focus or add to that focus. And I think it's trauma and betrayal and grief. And sometimes where the betrayal comes first and then the trauma, sometimes the trauma comes first and then the betrayal comes afterwards by the services. Or if we've been sexually abused as children, that's a betrayal, a terrible betrayal, and then I wasn't protected, and that was a betrayal. And then when I finally was old enough to get myself to the police station, they told me it's not real crime. And even now, as a much older woman, when I tried a couple of years ago, a young male officer started asking me questions about it in the foyer where there are other men all standing around. And that's a betrayal. And again, of course, it got nowhere. So there's another betrayal. So I've just used my personal lived experience purposefully to show a betrayal. And that's showing how the personal is the political, in that what's happened to men happens to women everywhere, happens to men everywhere that have been abused. And so that's something that we really need to understand, that one person's story can be an example of hundreds, thousands of people's experiences. I mentioned before that we've had a couple of announcements made in the last 6 months or so that give me hope for the future. And those announcements are that the government is establishing the peak body for lived experience and the peak body for consumer, for carer, family and kin experience, and also the peak body for a lived experience association, or whatever the words will be. How do you feel that might influence the future of lived experience leadership?
I think for a part of what we've been doing has been, as a movement, has been very intuitive and very resourceful in terms of coming into a system and infiltrating and being a little bit like guerrillas coming in and disrupting a system that's stuck, that wasn't working, and that is harming people and continues to harm. But it's time for us to move out of the shadows of the jungle into the fight and establish those structures to enable us to have a place where we can come to, and we can organise, and we can go out, in our full regalia or profile, and participate in the dialogue, the debate that hasn't been a debate because it's been one-sided. The voice of lived experience has always been marginalised. It's always been treated with derision and suspicion. It's easy for traditional systems, to label lived experience as being unscientific or anti-psychiatry, or, God forbid, Church of Scientology type influences coming in and influencing
we
the
were
way.
accused of that at one stage, weren't we? When we were
We
making
were.
sound, we were a couple of the leading the experts in psychiatry accused us of being.
Well,
that.
of using. I think, to be fair to the gentleman, I think it was more that they accused us of utilising the methods and the content or whatever of the Church of Scientology, but it was negating our argument very simplistically by this association. The same thing, we're currently witnessing a real a burgeoning of evidence about, say, the problems with antidepressants, for instance, and the evidence that points to that they're probably not very effective, and two, that they do cause significant side effects and difficulty coming off them, including feelings of suicidality and a whole range of things. We still haven't got the context or the places where we can carry out that argument, and I hope these peak bodies will allow that to happen. That people will have to engage, because we're there, we're consumer peak body, and as a carer peak body, and then as a professional association to grow the workforce. So it legitimises what we're doing, I suppose, and allows us to participate in the larger debate that occurs. I think just to differentiate the two, we go to the peer workforce and the professional association. We're in the middle of workforce shortages. We're moving from a biomedical workforce to a psychosocial sort of approach, a recognition that mental health is often determined by your socioeconomic indicators, etc., the way you live, where you live, the opportunities you have, your past, and that intergenerational stuff. And we have a workforce that's ready to go, and it makes sense to have the ability to organise, to set standards, to also be accountable, somewhere where we can be accountable to, rather than being loosely structured. And often I think the way we've evolved has been piecemeal. So I think, again, it's about having that structure so important. I think with the national peaks, you were there back in 2012, Faye, when the National Mental Health Consumer Organisation was being formed under Mark Butler's government. He was part of the government at the time, and the tremendous amount of 2 or 3 years of work that went into there through the expert reference group, and then the devastation of having that taken away from you by simply by a change of government and the lack of funding. We have fought collectively to keep that on the agenda and to do that, and then we've moved in strategic ways in working in combination with the carer movement to articulate the importance of having two separate peaks.
Mm.
And that separateness is important because as individuals having our own autonomous identity, we can relate more maturely to each other. We
Mm.
can have discussions between us and come to common understandings, or areas where we don't agree. But I think it's really good.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Kerry, coming from the carer, family, kin perspective, what do you think about this? The two peaks back when uh, over the previous, like a decade or so ago, the carers were wanting it to be one peak. What do you feel about this having the two peaks? What are the advantages? Are there disadvantages? What do you think?
Yeah, great question, Faye. And I think there are tremendous advantages in having a combined voice where your interests align. Government often will use the excuse of, oh, but we're hearing so many different perspectives on this issue and, divide and conquer approaches. So there is a lot to be said about having a combined voice. I think that combined voice is even more powerful when it's coming from two separate but aligned bodies.
Mm.
And so I think that's the flip side of having two separate bodies. I think the other advantage for me, aside from, of course, autonomy and identity and that history, often back in the day when everybody had been told that these were, medicalized understandings of distress, that very often families would speak on behalf of consumers, which was, as you're saying, they probably experienced as betrayal amongst other things.
Mm.
But I think also there is this long, slow, very, very silent trajectory in Australia once deinstitutionalisation occurred, that suddenly many family members did find themselves being cast into mini-me clinician carer roles, and in some ways legitimising continuing experiences of people that we have called severe and enduring mental illness. But in doing that, families' needs have dropped off the radar as well. And so I think there is a case for pushing back on that designation. It really does tend to legitimise the current system. And I'm very, very interested in families' needs being recognised as having been stripped away from many families. Many families lost their financial autonomy, their career autonomy, many other experiences of disadvantage because of the failure of the system. So I think there is an opportunity with that division of into two separate bodies, that actually families' needs can be identified and brought to the fore as well, in alignment with the consumer body. Because I think at the end of the day, what we are united around is the fact that the system has failed all of us. So I think there's an opportunity to amplify each other's voices.
I think, Kerry, because of your leadership and Sharon Lawn's leadership and other carers' leadership, as a person with lived experience, I've seen a really big change, and I love you and Sharon and other carers for this change. That 20 years ago, we had a lot of carers that were really trying to overtake what people with lived experience were saying, and it was so hard, because the medical model, politicians, the community go, oh well, you listen to carers because you can trust them, that you can confide in them, that they'll do all the hard work, they're responsible, but mad people, they're going to cause disruption, they could be violent, all of these really negative connotations. And what we were finding was that the carer voice was much stronger than the lived experience voice. But now, because of the generosity and the recognition that this pain belongs to people with lived experience and carers, and coming together and respecting each other's situations and experiences and betrayals, has brought this beautiful camaraderie that, to be honest, Kerry, I was never expecting, because of the experiences that I'd had, and I value you so much for that. Priscilla, you're sitting as a CEO in a state peak, yet you and the other state peak CEOs have done a wonderful thing in coming together to make your voices stronger. Could you explain to people what the state peaks have done, Priscilla?
Yeah, sure. Actually, that work started before I even started working at Being. So even that has been a long-term project. Basically, every jurisdiction apart from the Northern Territory has a state or territory peak. We've all come together. We've signed a MOU, and we meet once a month to talk about both state and national issues. And I guess just stand there in solidarity with each other, because some of the challenges that we're facing in our jurisdictions can be really challenging. And it's amazing to have a group of colleagues who have not just shared lived experience, but also are in a similar kind of role with similar challenges that they're fighting against. So I love that group, which is called the National Mental Health Consumer Alliance. We actually incorporated as an organisation a few months ago, back in January 2024. So that's an exciting development. And I think in terms of the national peak, whoever it is, will be, there's unique work there, because the work that the Alliance is doing, we're kind of doing that kind of as part of our day role, like almost as volunteers in a way. So it's almost too much work for us to do just as us, as state and territory peaks. We really do need that national voice as well to speak to national issues and the national, the federal government. That's a whole other different piece of work. Many consumers may not know that some of the services they use are funded through national programs and some through their state or territory programs. So there's a whole other piece of work that has hardly been touched that the peaks will be doing when they've been allocated the funding. So I think it's exciting. I think we're in an exciting period right now.
Is there something that you're focusing on, something that you think will be really important in the future that leaders, and when I say leaders, I'm talking about everybody, including the peer worker that started yesterday, that we can focus on, work towards, that might make our human rights more recognised and more honoured and respected?
To me, workforce is central, and currently, we have a combination of people working within public mental health services and trying to disrupt and transform and change those. And then we also have people working for non-government organisations, and increasingly, but a small proportion of people running, working in, say, as workforce in peer-run organisations. But in the future, I just think if we can continue to adapt and change the way those services interact with people, the biomedical model and the concept of risk of illness, or if we use that paradigm, means that we have mental health laws that contradict or override human rights legislation, such as the Convention of Persons with Disabilities. So currently we have the overuse of involuntary methods, which actually has the opposite effect to what it should. People who experience that sort of care don't want it anymore. It's been traumatizing. And so the last thing they will do, and I can speak that this is my own experience as a young person, the last thing you want to do after a traumatizing episode of inpatient care is actually go back for more. So you're very reluctant to interact with mental health, whatever. It's all tarnished, I suppose. So as we increase the lived experience workforce, I think we'll get a kinder and more gentle connection of people with services, and people might start to want to interact with services when they're feeling a bit wobbly. And then ultimately it would follow that then we might get less need for coercive or involuntary care, and we might sort of be able to disable or undermine those sorts of restricted practices that involuntary practice more and more in mental health, or at least show that it's not needed, so that people are, I think with safe havens are a good example, where you have alternative to ED, where people with mental health issues or suicidal ideation can go and be with peers, and people will go back to that setting and not need clinical support. They'll be able to get on with their life, and I like that, where people start to then be agents in their own health, physical and mental, without that fear that currently characterizes a lot of people's experiences.
It's only been the last 6 years out of the last 30, 40 years where I haven't been on enforced treatment. And I have always felt like I'm just one step away from being thrown back in there, So yeah. And it's traumatizing. It's so traumatizing. What do you think, Kerry? What are you thinking about that needs to be done to ensure the human rights of people with lived experience and carers and family, and civic rights as well? We may be getting our human rights, basic human rights met, but lots of us aren't. But very often, even if we are getting the basic human rights met, we're often not getting our civic rights.
Yeah, that's such a huge shift, Faye, and I'm never sure where you start that conversation, because ultimately it's an ideological and cultural shift, paradigm shift that's required. So, like, I think, and I'm mindful of children's voices, particularly now, have never been more silenced, and their needs have never been more not met by our current communities and societies that we live in. In some ways, the focus when we talk about human rights and mental health has been around in the moment, in the service, downstream when there's been no investment in any other least restrictive alternatives, conversations around seclusion, restraint, coercion, other violent forms of interaction. So we've intentionally built a violent system. So the natural response, political policy response, would be to invest in upstream services, prevention, rights-based, person-centred, needs-adapted, socially determinant addressing services that meet people's needs. So we're never in these crisis moments, but we never, of course, do that. So, I think partly the lived experience leadership initiatives and the lived experience workforce, because they are conceptualising themselves as rights holders, will lead some of that change. But I also think somehow, somewhere, we have to start having conversations with, like all movements, where the role of allyship might sit in some of these conversations as well. But I do think that the education of everyone, the literacy around that broader conceptualisation of rights is critical.
We've come to the end of our time, but just before we go, I wonder if one thing could be done that would improve the lives of people with lived experience and people with carer, family and kin experience. What do you think is one thing that could make a noticeable difference?
A universal basic income. I think we've got people living in poverty whose hope of affecting a full citizenship and recovery is difficult. I think we have to look at redistributing resources in that respect, and I think that has to be reflected as to our mental health systems and the way we're resourcing them. The lived experience space needs a far more actual resourcing as well. So that's probably a couple of things there. I cheated a little bit.
That's right.
Like rules anyway. The government announced this week, the federal government announced this week around the Human Rights Act that looks like that might happen at a federal level. So that is extremely exciting. I think it also needs to happen at a state level as well, or state and territory level, because of course some of the laws that govern mental health services are at the state level. So we need protections at all jurisdiction levels. I think also we need something like a revolution, I think. And I don't mean like the French Revolution. We're not coming to chop psychiatrists' heads off. We're not that scary. What we are going to do is try and demedicalize the system, because I think if we continue in this biomedical model, exactly what Tim said, you know, if we don't move to the social model, then we're going to be stuck forever. Thinking about mental health drivers and how people get mental health challenges in the first place through, you said earlier, Faye, trauma and violence. Let's look there. Take a long-term approach, not just more beds, more psychiatrists, etc.
Thank you, Priscilla. Kerry?
Yeah, I know, I agree. There's so many opportunities. That one of the challenges of Federation is, work at both levels of government. But I do think potentially something like the wellbeing budget is a lovely driver that we could be using a whole lot more as well. So looking at whole of government actions.
And could you expand on that a little bit, Kerry? Because a lot of people wouldn't know what that is.
Yeah, right. So understanding that every investment we make as a community has a consideration around the mental health impacts. So whether it's around climate, whether it's around housing, whether it's around economic policies addressing inequality, just understanding that ultimately you're not really wanting a mental health sector to exist at all, because that's really the fallout of failed policies in other areas and in other portfolios. So an integrated approach to federal investment that takes into account the mental health impacts on everybody.
Great. Where I live is kind of like a microcosm of what's happening all over Australia, but ramped up, So because we've been so severely impacted by destruction of the natural environment, the floods and everything. And we have the highest suicide rate now in all of Australia, including taking into account Aboriginal communities. And I think that we really need to do all of the things that you've just mentioned, but the governments also need to be taking really certain action on stopping the destruction of old growth forest and preventing more destruction to the environment and animal species and the climate, because as particularly young people and Aboriginal people are so impacted by that. We all are, and it distresses me terribly. And lots of people are deciding not to have children anymore because of what the future might look like in that way. So, I think that we really need to be taking care of the environment. But I think if we probably established mental health services the way Aboriginal people would want them to be, we probably would do a much better job. We made the normal, natural responses that people have to trauma, betrayal, and grief. We medicalized it and then medicated it, rather than building the families, individuals, families, and communities up to wrap around people who are in distress and be the support that they need to be. And we need to become more human and less medical. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. There's so many things came to mind as we talked that I wanted to ask you questions about, and I probably would record 12 hours with you if I could. But I want to really thank you for all that you've done to bring the plight, the needs, and the opportunities that people with lived experience in care experience have and can offer to improve the lives of all people. I would hope that we could produce better communities so that far less people ended up having lived experience. Thank you for being the leaders that you are. Thank you for all that you've done and all that you'll continue to do. Thanks.